2 here. Kaylee, can you let me know when we're at a good number?
I think you're pretty good to go, Carolyn.
Good to go. Great. Welcome, everybody. We are so excited that you are able to join us. This is our listening session with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde for the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. I'm really glad everybody could join us. I know this is kind of late in the day, and so thank you so much for making some time to listen, because that's what the session is all about. I do want to go quickly over a few housekeeping tips. Please remember to mute your microphone. Also, if you can shut your cameras off, that's really going to help when guest tribal speakers are speaking, to have that focus be on them. We will also ask that you please hold your questions until the Q&A session. When the chat gets populated, it gets very distracting for the presenters and for others as well. We will let you know when we open for questions. We are recording the first part of this event. And so we are going to stop the recording at the Q&A piece, but the first part will be recorded. So I am going to go over now to David Harrelson and for the tribal welcome, and then we will also hear a welcome from FTA, Federal Highways, and our own Greg Johnson.
Thank you, Carolyn, for inviting us to participate and be a part of this. My name is David Harrelson. I'm the Cultural Resources Department Manager for the Grand Ronde Tribe. I've had the honor of working with Carolyn, as well as ODOT and WSDOT and others for many years, including the last iteration of this project. I'm going to present a little bit later, but I wanted to be able to just open this meeting up and kind of set context in this virtual space that we're in, and sort of bring some of those traditions that we have forward into this, space of technology, sort of indigenize our technology spaces instead of being technologicizing our indigeneity, I think was something that was said earlier. So as a part of that, one thing that you'll learn more is we see ourselves as the host of this place where this project is happening. We're the indigenous people of this place, and in that spirit, we welcome you to this conversation. That's a result of our people, our ancestors being of this place, signing treaties, being removed, coming back, living in these areas. We call this place home. And so just on behalf of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, I want to welcome you all to this space and this conversation that we're going to spend more time today learning about, and hopefully you can take information away today and be inspired to learn more about the history of this place. So with that, I'll turn it over. I believe next is either back to Carolyn or to Craig at Federal Highways.
Yeah, let's go over to I think it's going to be Phil Ditzler from Federal Highways, and then Linda Gerke from FTA.
I'll just say, David, thank you for that welcome and for hosting this space. Appreciate the hospitality there. Good afternoon. I do want to say thank you to the council members and the tribal members who have joined us today. This is a very important discussion for us. My name is Philip Ditzler. I'm the Division Administrator for the Federal Highway Administration. I'm in Salem, Oregon, and appreciate, again, you all joining us. This government-to-government engagement is very much an opportunity for us to strengthen our relationship and to discuss the Interstate Bridge Replacement Project, formerly known as the Columbia River Crossing. As Carolyn mentioned, the objectives that we hope to gain out of this is a deeper understanding of the project area, and that's from your perspective, both culturally and environmentally. This meeting is designed for us to listen and for us to learn, and again, to build upon past discussions that we've had. I think that you mentioned, David, so appreciate that. Thank you again for your time, and we look very much forward to the presentation. And that's all I have, Carolyn. Carolyn, thank you.
Boy, I've got the sun in my face, so I kind of feel a little shadowed. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this, hosting this listening session. We definitely want to hear everything we can from you and appreciate the board members and the other members that are participating. As Phil said so aptly, we want to listen and we want to understand the past and look toward the future. I'm Linda Gerke, the Federal Transit Administration Regional Administrator, and my territory includes Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. I think now we'll go over to Greg Johnson, who is our Program Administrator.
Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Greg Johnson. I'm the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program Administrator. And I would just like to once again say thank you for the invite. And also thank you for how the Grand Ronde has reached out to the program and how you have been a part of what we are trying to accomplish. So we know that knowledge of history is tremendously important to understanding, and understanding is key to having successful outcomes. So I look forward to learning more about the history of the Grand Ronde, and also being able to apply that to how we approach this program, this project, to make it successful. So once again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Greg. Sorry, I'm having the slow button here for the muting. Thanks, everybody. I think I'll just do a quick review about, again, just why we're here. During Columbia River Crossing, we did hold a very large full-day listening session where we had all the tribes come together to talk about the importance of this place and the location of the project area. COVID and a number of other timely things around the COVID situation, we can't get together. And so we are doing these individual listening sessions. And so I'm just so thankful and grateful to the folks from the Grand Ronde who are joining us today so we can hear about the importance of this place to them. So again, if you can hold your questions to the end, that would be great. And then Haley will read out your questions as we go at that time. But right now, I'm going to turn it back over to David here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn. I wasn't a part of the pre-meeting, so am I trying to share, or will our slide deck be shared for us? Perfect.
Yeah, we're going to pull your slide deck up, and then you just let us know when you want to advance it, okay?
Okay, I will do. Thank you. Well, it's great to join you all here today and also look at that participant list and know that after 12 years of working in the field of cultural resources for my tribe, I see a lot of familiar names on this list, which tells me that it's good that we're in relationship with people, and that, you know, some relationships are what the foundation of a lot of good work is based upon. And for those of you that we're not in relationship with yet, I'm excited about this opportunity so you can get to know a little bit more about us, about the history, about place, in hopes that, you know, in maybe another 10 years, we'll be able to look back and know that this is where our relationship started. So on the behalf of our team that's here, we're going to have 3 presenters today, and I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves when they start their portion of the presentation. So we'll do rolling introductions as we go along, but we'll have 3 presenters today. We're really hoping to just do a power introduction to different themes and topics, and then really leave room for questions. And while that won't be recorded, which we asked for specifically because the hope is to be able to just have candor and honesty sort of about that and kind of open dialogue and conversation. So, you know, please bring those questions so that we can engage in dialogue, and hopefully what we provide provides some of the foundation to get those conversations going. So next slide. So our presenters, like I spoke about, here's a picture, a historic image of the Willamette River and one of a Wapato field near Sauvie Island today. This area is extremely productive for along the river habitats, including the area of this project, and is oftentimes referred to colloquially as Wapato Valley. Because there was so much Wapato here. We'll see some pictures later, but Wapato is an arrow leaf plant that has an edible tuber and is a really important traditional food. Next slide. So to start, we really have to talk about the people of this place. And when we think about this place, we're thinking of the area where we've drawn a red circle around it and the yellow star, which is the project area for IBR. But more broadly, it sits within the context of the Lower Columbia River. And within the Lower Columbia River, the indigenous people, or the people that have lived there for a very long period of time, are ethnically Chinook. There's different bands and different tribes of Chinookan people. You have also two different languages. You have Lower Chinook and Upper Chinook. But this is a whole group of people that share similar language, customs, cultures, and it stretches all the way from the mouth of the Columbia River all the way up to Celilo Falls. For the purposes of this project, we're within Multnomah Chinook homelands. Just upriver of this, about where the Portland Airport is today, you have Cascade Chinook homelands. And if you go down the Willamette River and you start to work towards Oregon City and Willamette Falls, you get into Clackamas homelands. And so the other name here that's called out is Clawliwalla, and those are the indigenous people that were at the village at Willamette Falls. Willamette Falls was such an important fishery that there was actually its own tribal band of people that were from that place. So when we talk about the people of this place, there's people that came and visited, there's travelers that came through the area, there's neighbors, but then there's the indigenous people of that place. And these are those tribes or those bands of Chinookan people that are literally of this place. They're people that came into this area, maintained kinship ties. In cases like Willamette Falls, they're people that controlled the fishery there, where people paid taxes, a portion of their catch, in order to fish in those locations. So it's just important that we acknowledge that and sort of have a framework of indigeneity in this place as Chinook. Next slide. So not all Chinookan people, but the Chinookan people from this area of the project signed a treaty in 1855. Some other Chinookan people who are from upriver signed other treaties, as well as some Chinookan people from downriver at the mouth of the river signed treaties that were never ratified by the United States government. But the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, which is what's depicted here in red, which is roughly corresponding to an area within Northwest Oregon, is depicting the treaty area for tribes such as the Multnomah Chinook, the Clackamas Chinook, the Cascades Chinook. So on the right, the same yellow star depicts the project area. And oh, this is interesting. I guess I've never actually presented in Teams, and I'm realizing that my slide notes are not available. So bear with me a moment, maybe while I pull these up on a different presentation platform. So I will keep talking though. The map on the right that you see is a map that the Grand Round tribe has put together for the totality of all of our homelands. So it wasn't just people from the Willamette Valley Treaty that came to the Grand Round Reservation. It was also people from 6 other treaties throughout Western Oregon that were removed to the Grand Round Indian Reservation. So prior to the creation of the Grand Round Indian Reservation, there was no Grand Round tribe, right? There were these individual tribal groups like the Multnomah Chinook, the Clackamas Chinook, the Cascades, and others who were in those locations and moved to Grand Round. Oh, I'm getting help here from a colleague. So what we have is that after a reservation is created, you have a Grand Round people, which essentially are made up of all of the antecedent or the tribes that came before Grand Round. And that's made up of those individual tribes that signed on to the treaties. The other important takeaway about this is, well, if tribal people intermarry with each other and they move to different reservations, then doesn't everyone have a claim to that treaty? And that's not how the Western model of treaties works. Treaties vest themselves in a reservation. And in the case of the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, it called out in that treaty that for 20 years, payments associated both monetary, money, and goods were to be distributed to the people of that treaty. And subsequently, that money and those goods were distributed at the Grand Round Indian Reservation. And that is found in the Indian agent reports through all the government records that it exists at National Archives. So when there's the question of, well, why does Grand Round claim the Willamette Valley Treaty and all the people that were a part of it? It's because the legal records all show that the money and the pieces were distributed there at Grand Round. I think that a way to understand this in today's world is that there's a difference between political successorship, which is what I'm describing, and cultural affinity. So an Irish person can move to America and become Irish American, right? But it doesn't mean that they can vote in an Irish election, right? Because they're American citizens now. And I think that that's the context within tribal communities that often gets missed, is how the rights of these treaties connect to place. Another important piece for the Willamette Valley Treaty is that in addition to mentioning this area defined in red, there's a whole provision in the treaty that says that people from the north shore of the Columbia River are moving across the river south and relocating as a part of this treaty, and that if they can show a connection to that at a later point in history, they'll be compensated for moving. Which we'll talk about later, is that the river is a great connector. The river isn't the political boundary that we think of it as today. It was actually the main conduit for goods and relations. And so the people on both sides of the river, they were one people. They weren't a different people. And in the case of signing this treaty, because of the modern political boundary that was created of Oregon and Washington, the governments treated with the people differently in those places. Joel Palmer in Oregon, Isaac Stevens in Washington. Next slide. So as a part of those signatories, we have the names of the signatories for those chiefs, such as Wachino of the Clackamas, Tumulth and Obanahaw of the Cascades, Lal Bick, and other names. These are all people that signed those treaties and of which there's direct descendants at Grand Round, including many of our tribal council members today are descendant of one, if not more than one of these chiefs, as well as other chiefs of tribal people that came to the reservation. And that red star is not the project location. It got moved as a part of these slides. So just think about where the D is in Portland on this map. Next slide. Oh, I think we went back instead of forward. Perfect. So this is a picture of two different pictures, early in life and late in life, of a chief Casino, sometimes spelt Kazanov, sometimes spelt with a K, sometimes with a C. And what's important about this is a distinction. If people have heard of chiefs of the lower Columbia River, they've generally heard of Chief Concomly, who was a chief at the mouth of the Columbia River that controlled trade. And about the time that Concomly started to decline in power, and about the time that the fur trading center of operations moved from the mouth of the river to Fort Vancouver, the power shifted on the lower Columbia River, and this man came forward as sort of as noted here and described in historic sources, the chief of the Willamette tribe. I want to read an account from 1811, which is Frenchaire, which is a traveler and an explorer who's coming up the Columbia River, and it's a narrative that is occurring while he has a Clatsop chief with him known as Kalpo. And it's indicative of somewhat of the idea of territorial nature of the river. So having ascended the Cowlitz River about 1.5 miles on rounding a bend of the stream, they suddenly came in view of about 20 canoes full of Indians who had made a rush upon them with the most frightful yells. The 2 natives and the guide who'd conducted their little canoe retreated with the utmost prepotency with the necessary articles, and in the evening the party came back to our camp. We were then informed that the Indians whom Mr. McKay had met were at war with the Cowlitz, or with the Skileute, which are a Chinookan band of people from the mouth of the Cowlitz River. It was impossible, consequently, to close our eyes all night, the natives passing and repassing continually from one village to the other, making fearful cries and coming every minute to solicit us to discharge our firearms, all to frighten their enemies and let them see that they were on their guard. On the 5th, in the morning, we paid a visit to the hostile camp, these being the Cowlitz, and those savages who had never seen white men regarded us with curiosity and astonishment, lifting the legs of our trousers and opening our shirts to see if the skin of our bodies resembled that of our faces and hands. A few days after this, Frenchaire's party meets Cassino, who he would meet again on the Willamette 2 years later. So a part of what's depicting here is that the people who are interacting with the earliest traders and explorers are Chinook people of the Columbia River. They're the traders. And in this account, there's an interior people who's coming down the river and making war upon Chinookan people, in this case, the Cowlitz, that are coming from upriver to engage in hostilities with Chinookan people. And then as he goes further on down the river, it just reinforces that he comes into contact with Chief Cassino, who's at that point controlling the trade of the lower Columbia River and the lower Willamette systems. And this is that man. And I provide this as a context to just show that there is cultural differences and boundaries that have been taking place historically within the lower Columbia River system, as long as our written history and words exist. Next slide. So this is a pretty spectacular map, and there's a lot of context that's needed to understand what's happening here. But this is one of Lewis and Clark's maps of the area that roughly describes the mouth of the Willamette River. The challenge that you'll run into here is that the Willamette River is not depicted strongly. And so in the upper portion of this map, from left to right, you have downstream Columbia River to upstream. The yellow star is associated with what we call today Hayden Island, but was actually referred to by Lewis and Clark as Image Canoe Island, which we'll talk more about in a second. The area in blue is actually roughly the project area for IBR. The areas in red are noted village locations. The area on the right village location is actually depicted at the village that is approximately under where the Portland International Airport is today. On the left, you see a village that's essentially on Sauvie Island. Now, the challenge is why this map doesn't depict a very broad river. You see just a little bit of a line that comes down, and then the lower left-hand corner is actually a blown out version that's like a subset map showing the Willamette River prior to all the modification for the port facilities that were developed there. A part of what's going on here is that the mouth of the river didn't look like what it looks like today. In our Upper Chinookan language, it actually translates to the dammed up place. And it wasn't dredged out the way that it exists today. In fact, even fishermen today will tell you that the river itself actually runs down Multnomah Channel. That's where most of the volume of water goes that comes out of the Willamette River pouring into the Columbia, actually below Sauvie Island. Whereas there's stream connectivity, but most of that water doesn't pass directly into the Columbia. It turns and goes down Sauvie Island. So the dammed up place is roughly at the mouth of the river. When Lewis and Clark were coming down the river, they actually didn't even notice that the Willamette River existed because it was such a marshy area where the water just pushed out and over all the features of Sauvie Island in the mouth of the river. Think like the Columbia Slough and other things. And it's really hard to imagine this environment and land without the dredging and the diking that existed at that time. Besides having a village roughly near the mouth of the river, one of the other nearby villages is noted a little ways up the Willamette in that lower inset of the corner near St. John's. And that's actually as far up the Willamette River as the Lewis and Clark party traveled. The rest of the depictions that they showed in their map were actually based upon a sketch that was drawn in the sand by one of their Indian informants and guides. So this is a little bit of that landscape as Lewis and Clark saw it in 1806, a little bit of the confusion about understanding place and identity, but this project area is right in the middle of all that history. Next slide. So this was the drawing of a canoe that was made in the entry declaring what we think of now today as Hayden Island as Image Canoe Island. And the reason why they called it Image Canoe Island is because there were all these canoes pulled up on the shores of the island that were covered in these carved images. So Columbia River art form, which we're going to talk about later, is the indigenous art form of this region. And this is being depicted and reflected in all the canoes that are on the shore. These are highly decorated canoes. Some within the culture of Chinookan people, while Image Canoe Island isn't recognized as a burial island, that was one of the practices, is to actually identify different islands out in the river and bury people in canoes out on those islands. Next slide. So this is one of our canoes today, and this is us delivering a monument, a sculpture called Man from Cossack-Shicks to George Rogers Park on the waterfront. And I think it's important when we think about these places that, you know, the rivers were great connectors of the past, but they're also great connectors now. And our people still travel on these rivers. Oftentimes when we're returning to areas like this, it's as a part of the annual canoe journey or moving through these places. And this is Stankia and Olhayu are two canoes. Next slide. I wanted to include a picture of a traditional plank house, and this is the plank house that was built at Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge. Our ancestors lived in these large gable roof structures. They were a complete awe and inspiring. So when I showed those pictures of those villages, and each of those little triangle marks in Lewis and Clark's map depicted a house like this. The longest houses that have been documented are over 400 feet long. They're multi-generational housing. They're storehouses to keep goods like berries from the mountains, Wapato from the river valleys, camas from down south in the Willamette Valley. And there's an artistic tradition that's unique to the Chinook people. It's a part of our cultural identity of the people of the lower river. And it's these motifs and styles that you see represented here. The rib-like shapes, the tri-platform faces. These are all elements, circles within circles, square within squares, chevrons. These are all elements of that Columbia River art. Next slide. So this is an etching that was done in the 1840s by Alfred Agate. And it's actually believed to have been one of the plank houses that would have today been located where the Portland airport is. You see life as it existed in that Chinookan world. You see a fire pit in the middle. You see fish drying racks above. You see a dog. You see people playing a gambling game called Stick Game in the lower left-hand corner. And you see these individual bunks along the sides where individual private spaces existed for families or individuals within a house. One of the artistic forms that we see artists work in today is actually what was represented in these places as bunk rails. Oftentimes there would be a special design motif or a rail that would be set above someone's bunk to denote their place. And today, that's one of the things that we've seen artists turn into public art, which we'll see an example of later. Next slide. So when we think about the story of this story of the place being the project area, it's on the river. And the story of place here is canoes. And it was the same story of describing the area of downtown Portland as a traveling place that inspired this monument proposal. This is the concept art that was shown in an exhibit in the Pearl this summer called Traveling with Our Ancestors. And it's a proposal to have a larger than life steel cutout of a silhouette of a traditional canoe with people in it mounted to floating dock structures in downtown Portland as a way to show sort of ongoing and continuing presence of Native people, even when we can't be there in our canoes. Downtown Portland wasn't a living place, it was a traveling place. It's where people went back and forth. And when we think about a purpose of a bridge transiting people back and forth, which we have to have today, but to our ancestors, where everyone had a canoe, or maybe two or three, the idea of the river being a divider didn't exist. The river was the easiest thing to pass between and connected us. And so I think, looking to this recent proposal for public art, I think that it inspires that idea of some of the story of what this place is about, even on the nearby Columbia River. Next slide. These are the bunk rails that I told you would be forthcoming. You have bighorn sheep on the left and you have kingfisher on the right. Note the rib-like patterns. You'll see triangle shapes, inverted triangles, some chevrons. These are on the 5th floor of the Urban Studies building at Portland State, and a really exceptional example of the regional art form from this place. Next slide. Probably the best well-known depiction of Chinookan Lower Columbia River art is a part of an art installation that was a gift from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde to the city as a part of the installation of the Tillicum Crossing. So when the new pedestrian bridge, transportation bridge in downtown Portland was named Tillicum Crossing with the support and ongoing participation in the naming committee of David Lewis, who was a tribal member and staff at the time, the tribe came forward and commissioned Greg Robinson to create this piece as well as some other associated pieces to depict Columbia River art as a part of that installation. And today you can see both imagery on either end of the bridge. On the east side of the bridge, there's a large bronze disc. And you can park in the OMSI parking lot to see those. And then there's basalt carvings on either end of the bridge on the west and east side. So these are just some examples. I wanted to share some of that history of that place, the takeaway of this, but also these artistic traditions that belong in this place. I said this is the art form of this region. And I think for people that aren't as familiar with art or the cultural history of place, I think that we may have this false understanding that totem pole art is the native art of the Pacific Northwest. And that's partially true, but there's multiple Native American artistic traditions within this region. And the best known is formline or totem pole art. But that art form is from about halfway up Vancouver Island and into Southeast Alaska. And when you get south of halfway down Vancouver Island through the Seattle area, there's another form of art called Salish art. And the citizens and people of Seattle have lately been doing a lot of work, including WSDOT, on a recent ferry terminal to actually promote the Salish art form. But here on the Columbia River, where this project is, we're in an entirely different area of an artistic style. And that artistic style that's indigenous to this place is Columbia River art, or Chinookan art. And it's a real hope of mine, as well as people at Grand Round, to see this project in some way incorporate the art form of these people that was represented by the island that it crosses over as Image Canoe Island being represented as a part of this project. And for the next portion, we're going to turn it over to Tori Wakeland. If you could join us, Tori. He has some slides and will introduce himself and then talk to you a little bit more about some of the environmental work that the tribe does and some of the topics that we'd like to bring forward on that front.
Yes, thank you very much, David. I really appreciate that. My name is Tori Wakeland. I'm the Active and Ceded Lands Program Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Round, and also a Grand Round tribal member. Little bit of background on me and what my position is here. My primary role is to kind of act as kind of the consultation lead between the tribes and outside agencies to promote tribal resources within tribal ceded homelands. My background is in wildlife biology, and I was previously the aquatic biologist for the tribe. So having kind of filled that role previously, I was asked to kind of give just a quick talk about some resources in the area, where our concerns might lie. I understand that there's a habitat mitigation working group associated with this project, so I don't really want to get too heavy into biological talk and scientific data, but more so just kind of an overarching view of how the tribe views natural resources and what our take is on this project. So if we go to, I think the next slide should be my first slide here. That one there. Okay, great. So, a lot of times when we're dealing with these projects, especially this one here at the Columbia River, where we're crossing a body of water, the first thing that comes to folks' heads and in agencies having to do ESA type work and NEPA work is, what are our listed species? What are our listed fish species? And that tends to be kind of the focus as to what maybe the conservation effort might be, or kind of the perception that this is going to be the most important thing to the tribe, being these listed fish species, which is very true. We do consider our salmon to be very important to us, but we want to make sure that there's a difference between understanding requirements of ESA and NEPA and the fact that these get considered, or these species get considered mainly for statutory regulation type reasons, and not wanting to overlook consideration in the planning process, which could result in legal ramifications or something on the agency. But that there's a bigger meaning for us when we're talking about these species, and it's not necessarily from a regulatory or kind of more of a political base. So next slide, please. So what we have here is just kind of a depiction of some older pictures along with a newer picture showing a different relationship that we have with salmon species, fish species, aquatic species in general. We think of these resources very differently than just legal, regulatory, or even treaty obligations, but more so as a way of life and a lifeline, and the cultural tie between the species of the area and our ancestors and the people today. For us, the lines between natural resources and cultural resources are very blurred and quite overlap. And what some folks may consider to be a hard line between natural resources and cultural resources, in our world is very much a lot of the times one and the same. A natural resource very well could be a cultural resource for us, and vice versa. What we have depicting here, kind of in the left two depictions, are some platform fishing from some historic photos, and then just to kind of re-show that continued connection today. The rightmost photo that you're seeing there is from the first fish that we caught when our dip net fishing rights were restored to us up at Willamette Falls, so just not far from where the project area is. This particular photo actually depicts the first fish that we caught after having our rights restored in that manner. I believe it was about the first time that we had fished in almost 100 years, or around about 100 years at this location. So that cultural tie between actually being out there and exuding your culture and being able to fish in the spots that your ancestors fished in is very important to us. So we have a bit of a different tie with the species in that regard. Next slide, please. Okay, this one's got a little bit of a video to it here. I'll give an explanation as to what's going on first. So you can see here it's an ARIS sonar unit that's placed on Agency Creek here in Grand Ronde. What this unit does is, previously on Agency Creek, we had a fish weir, and as salmon, steelhead, any migratory fish species are moving up Agency Creek, coming out of the South Yamhill, coming up in and onto the reservation, they would have to come through the fish weir where we could count them, mark them, and then re-release them to go upstream to spawn. This was kind of a manpower intensive process, as it had to be, the fish weir itself had to be manned 24 hours a day while fish were running. So someone had to be down there. It was, very time demanding. You had to clean debris out of the fish weir to keep it from overflowing and flooding into the adjoining areas. So what this is what the kind of conical shape that you're seeing furthest on the bottom of the screen is actually where the ARIS unit sits, and it's a sonar unit looking straight across the breadth of the stream itself. So if you're thinking of it this way, the bottom edge of the blue cone shape there is going to be the eastern shore of Agency Creek, with the uppermost portion of the blue area there being the eastern shore, and the current flowing from right to left on the screen. So if you can press play on that, we can see kind of a clip of how this works and how we can monitor fish going up and down the stream. We should be able to get, hopefully that works inlaid in here. You can see kind of mid-screen there, you see a pair of fish that are starting to move up and down. This allows us to be able to track and monitor the fish that are coming up and down Agency Creek. Really cool unit. We can see everything down to like small crayfish coming up and down the stream. You can see pairs of fish as they come up and kind of work their way back down and then pass by, and small schools of fish. So you may be wondering, well, what is this pertaining to the project area, and why have I included it in this? And it's just to illustrate a point that we're still very, very much connected to the Columbia River, even from where we're located at here in Grand Ronde. With Grand Ronde being only 30 miles from the Pacific Ocean, it's kind of unique by like air miles, if you will. It's kind of unique in the fact that we're not connected to the Pacific on that side. We're not connected on the western side of Grand Ronde to the ocean. These fish that you're seeing in this ARIS unit shot have come from the Pacific up the Columbia, all the way up the Willamette into the South Yamhill, and then into Agency Creek, making a trip of over 300 miles to make it to where Grand Ronde is today. So even with our current projects that we're doing here on the reservation with these fish species that we work with, we're still very, very intimately connected with what's going on in the Columbia River, as all the fish species that reach here use that Columbia River as their avenue to get here. Next slide, please. Going to touch on another species here. This is one that we press for quite a bit and we talk about quite a bit. And I know that it gets brought up quite a bit more during project design and scoping processes and during the NEPA process and things like that. But it's not a listed fish. These are Pacific lamprey. This is also a migratory fish, very important culturally to the tribe as a food source. We kind of hold the stance that we want to make sure that we are getting out ahead of these issues before it becomes to the point where they have to be listed. If we can stay on top of lamprey habitat management, lamprey population management, passage issues, spawning ground issues, preserving those things, then hopefully we can prevent the lamprey from ever getting to the point that we've seen with, say, steelhead or different salmonid species. This picture here is of us harvesting at Willamette Falls, and if you can go ahead and hit play on the video there, there's a cool video here just kind of showing the intimacy that we have with this species specifically. This is not a species that you can catch on line or pole. You actually have to physically get in the water and catch these by hand, which you see here, going down into the water right up underneath Willamette Falls. You're grabbing them by hand and essentially just putting them in bags. So there's a very, very intimate connection with this species. It's not something where you're, like I said, you're just tossing a line into the water and you reel your hook up. We're on the line at Willamette Falls. Historically, there's been accounts of deaths up at Willamette Falls catching these species. So it's something that, again, it crosses that cultural and natural resources boundary, where these lines are. There is no defining line that separates this natural resource from our cultural resource. This is a natural resources and cultural resource all combined into one. To just kind of speak on terms of the project, lamprey anisetes, the juvenile lamprey, when they're hatched in fresh water, they live down in the substrate, in the, say, the river bottom, in kind of the muddy, silty substrate of the river bottom. And they can live there for 7+ years before they make their trip out to the ocean and mature. So during the process of construction of a bridge or a crossing like this, we need to keep in mind that even though you can't see the fish there, it's very well likely that they're down in the substrate underneath where it's going to be excavated. So I'm sure this topic will come up in the NEPA process and on the ESA side, but I just kind of wanted to kind of give a brief overview of that kind of technical side of it, that just because you're not seeing these species swimming through the water as you would say salmon, for example, does not mean that they aren't present. They could be very well directly under your feet. You could be standing right on top of them and not really know that they're there. Next slide, please. So we've touched on 2 different migratory fish species, and again, this is something that gets brought up a lot, is the importance of migratory fish species. And I think what gets overlooked a lot of the times is our resident fish species and what a large role they played in our culturally in our lives today, and historically for the ancestors who lived at these areas. If you hit play here, this is just going to show, we don't have to show the whole video here, but you're going to see some sturgeon swimming. This is up at Willamette Falls. We simply took a GoPro and hooked it to the end of an oar and shoved it down in the water. It looks like it might be frozen up a little bit, but you'll see large schools of sturgeon swimming around down here, and just kind of wanted to remind folks that when we're thinking about the natural resources that we're interested, it's not going to just be these migratory fish species like salmon and then again like lamprey. It's going to be all the resident fish species that we're looking at, whether that's white sturgeon, You can see another one moving there. I think you can see couple more should come into screen here. And you can just tell by the size of them how important of a species this would be for folks living at the falls as a food source, etc., or in the lower Columbia River. But we're talking about sturgeon, cutthroat, large-scale sucker, bridge-lip sucker, chub, sculpins, freshwater mussels, crayfish. All of these resident species, if you will, are still just as highly important and is culturally significantly important as any of the big migratory fish species that a lot of folks focus on in these projects. Next slide, please. So this one, I just wanted to depict something here with a single picture. What we get asked a lot in these types of planning processes is, can you prioritize for us the species that you are most interested in? Is there, tell me the species that mean the most to the tribe, or mean the most culturally, or have the most natural resources significance to the tribe. We don't really think of the landscape in that manner. We don't think of our natural resources in that manner. Each one is equally as important as the next. I wanted to kind of show this picture here because I would say that if you could depict anything in this picture, or anything that this picture picks up, is equally as important as the next. The fish that you may or may not be able to see down into the waters are just as important as the vegetation on the bank, the birds, fish, terrestrial animals, reptiles, amphibians, berries, roots, shoots, tubers. They're all going to have equal importance to us. We don't really think of things in a hierarchical setting like that. They all have their place in our lives, and they might fulfill different roles in our lives, but they're all equally as important. So even if these aren't ESA listed species or species of concern, doesn't mean that they're not necessarily of concern to us. We want to make sure that is all encompassing. We want to see everything connected to each other. If we were going to look at some sort of place anything in a hierarchical status, we would simply just state that we want an intact and functional ecosystem, and that's going to include all the species that you can find in the ecosystem. I'll go ahead and finish that off and pass this along here, but just for folks' reference, if you want to kind of get an idea a little bit more about cultural significance of different species, or get a little more background on maybe how all these things kind of fit together, I'm going to drop a link into the conversation chat here, and it is our tribal connections map. This is a map that was created that you can kind of get a bigger, broader view of the history of the people of the place, and how we connect and how we view the natural environment and how we interact with that. So feel free to look at that at your own time. It's a really, really great tool to learn a bit more about the history and the connection of the natural environment. So thank you very much. And I think I can pass it on to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Tori. Good evening, everybody. My name is Brees Edwards. I am the manager for the Preservation Office of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. My background is actually in archaeology, so lots of school digging square holes. But this evening, I'm hoping to share a little bit more about the perspective that we bring into these sorts of engagements to help with bringing Grand Ronde perspective into these undertakings. So next slide, please. So a little bit of stage setting. Our office operates from a perspective of people, place, and practice. That These kind of serve as legs that stand through time. You know, places on the landscape were managed for, were cared for, you know, stewardship actions played out. That's the practice. And that those were undertakings by the people historically of those places. And so we bring that perspective to actions today, as well as bring awareness of those past kind of interconnected perspectives. We also work from a guest host perspective that, you know, this is a universal relationship of people of an area being responsible to that area and providing for the guests of that area who may come and visit and then go home. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get how does that work in a modern sense? So I've got an example here. If anybody's ever been to Disney or your choice of amusement parks, right? You as the visitor, you are the guest. You are there and capitalizing on the work of others, the people who have been stewarding that place. And those are the hosts, and those are the individuals that have the most intimate of knowledge, that know that when the humidity goes up 3 degrees or 3%, that they are going to be needing to lay in more ice cream and crank the air conditioning because more people are going to come in for 3 hours, and they'll be having to schedule to make sure that the guests can be accommodated for, or that guests need to be regulated for in their action. So that's maybe a modern context for what guest host responsibilities can look like. There's the stewardship responsibilities also that we operate from and try to bring awareness from those past responsibilities into the contemporary landscape. And Tori's examples with the salmon and the lamprey, the studies that they do with those biologics are an example of what stewardship looks like today, ensuring that there's water quality and health of environment for those species is part of the stewardship responsibility. And then there is the landscape perspective. That is where Tori kind of left was this notion that all elements are interconnected. And we bring that in our cultural lens as a landscape. That is the bridge here depicted on the slide. Those salmon that Tori was talking about swam under this bridge and made it all the way up. That is part of that landscape perspective. That 300 plus mile journey is just one element of that. And that there's the notion of also knowing that those fish species needed to have healthy waypoints along that trek to recover from the transition into the river environment and the food source that they need, etc. So next slide. So that kind of larger landscaping, then kind of how do we engage with time? You know, as a historic preservation office, we bring into our regulatory responsibilities perspectives of the past. And with that, we bring in all time as valid. And this kind of helps depict that as an element of landscape. You know, we have a modern sense of understanding. You know, we all have a sense of what we did yesterday with a certain sense of confidence and robustness of understanding and shared understanding. But as we go back in time, there tends to be kind of less clarity, less confidence in it with the historic period, looking at newspaper articles, journal articles, we still have confidence in it because there's a sense of tangible. The tribe has its history that plays out before there's writing. That is an econym, that is sometimes referred to as oral history. I want to shy away from the word of myths or stories. That tends to diminish it. And when you're a culture without written record, the oral tradition is the way that you carry history forward, not in newspapers or printed in books. It's how your elders share that understanding. Through our office, through guidance here, we bring that awareness to awareness and understanding into our project engagements. So next slide, please. There we go. So, with that, I'm a bit of stage setting. Here we have IBR, and this is a very large landscape that this undertaking sits within. It is part of a literal landscape. It, as an undertaking, is also its own landscape, if you will. And it's traversing a lot of area, as everybody on this call is aware. It is, how do we bring those understandings that the perspectives that we are positioned with into the APE, that area of potential effect. And that is the direct AP as well as the indirect APE. And what does that broader area look like? And what are those resources that may be of concern, and what are the levels of impact that may play out across this area? Next slide, please. So one way that we can approach that is to look through time, and not as static Polaroids of time, which these kind of stacked elements give a false impression, but think of it as a cumulative understanding through time. In that storied time, the econym, that oral history, has been there since it occurred, which may be thousands of years, and it's withstood time. So it's been continual through time depth. And then we have another moment of change of the first, the peopling of this area, the Chinook people that Dave referenced, and their level of connection. And then we have the early colonial elements, which is a smaller, thinner band of time, and then the Euro-American settlements, thinner, but each of those are still engaging with everything that is prior to it. And I think that that's a perspective that in the cultural resources engagement thus far, I think that the team is recognizing, and I greatly appreciate that. What I hope is coming forward here is that one of these elements is not overriding another one. It's to say that we have pre-contact that is quite deep. We have a colonial period that isn't as deep. We have Euro-American settlement, not that deep in time. So next slide. So let's get to the so what question. And with that is simply to say that cultural resources are everywhere. And I'm deliberately using the term cultural resource, not just archaeology. All of these depicted here are within 2 miles of each other. And they are everything from culturally modified tree. We have foundations of a building that are bisecting the earlier colonial settlement. We have some of the very first structures of European settlement sitting on top of the indigenous village site that predated that. So it is to say we have material evidence in different forms, in different materials, not just archaeological. So going from a landscape down to very specific objects and loci. And that's an element that our office brings into these conversations and into large scale projects like this. So next slide, please. And that is that we bring with us experience of field methods for inclusive natural and cultural resource understanding, as Tori suggested. We are very familiar with non-intrusive techniques as built-in moments in cultural resource study as a way of helping target next steps, working with design and implementation, as well as recording strategies. These are all concerns that play out in the world of cultural resources, because it's not just looking at the cultural resources and regulatory fulfillment for this project and undertaking. It is to look at how are you capturing this information in a meaningful way that is for those communities who are the source of those resources, still here today, but for the future. And recording is absolutely imperative to make sure that that can be met. There is informed understanding, as I showed with the people, place, and practice, the landscape approach, the details of the stewardship, that intimate knowledge of how actions play out in a place, like this particular APE, conversations about what the riparian zones used to be and what you might encounter or what may be appropriate to see returned. And that goes to the context and interpretation, looking at how do you present some of this information that may be sensitive, and then getting into conversations about, as an ongoing process, what best fits as a design element and what best fits for future conversations about mitigation. And I'm bringing that up here because it's never too early to discuss it. It may be too early to refine it or get to an end point with it. I bring that up because with NEPA process, it's very easy, or maybe not easy. It's familiar to bring forward discussions of mitigative actions for species or habitats so that it can be planned accordingly. Cultural resource process is a bit more iterative, and as a result, you don't know enough about what will be mitigated for until very late in the process, as you accumulate more information and refine your understanding about scale and scope of impacts. And that leads us into the conversation of agreement documents. Our office and the tribe as a whole has a lot of experience with these as applied documents for cultural resources as well as natural resource partnerships and processes, as well as keeping in mind what is best for the resource. So those are a couple of examples, and it's not to get into the details of you're likely to encounter stone artifacts or saturated anaerobic environments, and therefore high preservation of wood products and basketry material. those are detailed conversations, and we can get into those, but I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions and answers, and as those come up. So next slide. What I'd like to do is kind of leave my portion of the conversation with our approach here is to talk about a ancestry, and that through these approaches that we've laid out, it hopefully is the difference of a black and white photo and bringing forward high resolution, lots of detail, and bringing color to that same understanding or to that same place. So I look forward to some questions and happy to answer any. Next slide. I'd like to turn it over to Dave.
Great. Thank you, Brees and Tori. I appreciate your comments, your input, your presentations. This is really the last slide that I want to leave everyone with while we have question and answer. I know that there's one more slide presenter, but I want to leave this with you because these are 3 books that if you're looking to learn yourself about information related to the cultural history of this area and the Lower Columbia River, these are books that you should turn to. And I do that in part because throughout my life, by people wiser than I've been advised to always look for the information that people are not sharing with me, and to seek that out and to really know things myself. Right. We have a saying in our community, it's fine to read it in a book, but then you have to have your elders confirm it. Right. That's how we approach things from an oral history, culture, and tradition. But however, I think that we've reached somewhat of a point within the field of tribal relations and others where you can listen to people, but you also need to do some of the work and go and search and make sure that you know these things yourself. And I think the other part is that piece of advice that I've been given is that rarely when people ask you to go look yourself and point you in the direction of sources to start, are those the people that are misleading you? And I want to make sure that all of you know that the information that we're sharing is honest, it's earnest. There's a great degree of research and input that has sort of been based upon that. You see that we've gone to the extent of actually getting the original handwritten treaties and mapping out our own treaty areas. This is something that Grand Round takes very seriously, and that we've have a staff that's dedicated a lot of time and energy to the accuracy, but also authenticity to put these things forward. And so in the spirit of ensuring the quality of that information, you should go look yourself. And these are some good books. There's a few other, but be cautious of, your source. Make sure you're reading peer-reviewed material and content, making sure that you're making these sort of educated decisions and ask questions of people. But yeah, I just want to kind of encourage that as we move into question and answer. At this point, I don't know if Carolyn, if you want to come back on and encourage questions or kind of facilitate that part of question and answer, but it would be the point that we would ask for the recording to stop.